August 15th, 1962. The Korean Demilitarized Zone. It is early afternoon, the sky is clear, visibility is perfect, and there is no fog, no cover, no chaos. On the southern side of the most heavily fortified border on Earth, a 22-year-old American soldier steps away from his assigned position and begins walking north. He is not running, not crawling, not trying to disappear into the landscape. He walks openly at a steady pace toward armed North Korean guards standing behind barbed wire and sandbags, their machine guns already aimed at the open ground in front of them. There is no escape route, no backup plan, no signal to anyone on either side of the border. The soldier believes that if he is captured, the punishment will be temporary. He believes the Cold War operates on exchanges, prisoners for prisoners, men for men. He believes the other side will not shoot someone who is clearly surrendering. What he does not understand is that the step he is about to take cannot be reversed. Because the moment he crosses that invisible line in the grass, he will no longer be a soldier, no longer a prisoner of war, and no longer a citizen with a way home. For the next 4 decades, he will remain inside North Korea, not as a visitor and not as a hostage, but as a permanent asset of the state. He will become the only man in modern history to enter North Korea alone, without an army, without weapons, and without permission, and never be allowed to leave. The question is not why he crossed the border. The real question is whether this was an invasion, or the moment he trapped himself forever. James Joseph Dresnock was born in 1940 in rural Virginia, far from geopolitics, ideology, or the Cold War. His childhood was unstable, shaped by poverty, a broken household, and repeated exposure to violence and alcohol. School offered no escape, and by his late teens there were few paths available to him that promised structure or security. At 18, Dresnock enlisted in the United States Army, not out of patriotism, but because the military offered something that his life never had: regular meals, a paycheck, and rules that were clearly defined. By the early 1960s, the world he entered was tense and volatile. The Cold War was accelerating, Berlin had just been divided by concrete and wire, and the Korean peninsula existed in a permanent state of suspended war. Dresnock was deployed to South Korea and stationed near the Demilitarized Zone, a narrow strip of land filled with minefields, watchtowers, and soldiers trained to shoot first and ask questions later. Away from home and under constant pressure, his behavior deteriorated. He drank heavily, got into fights, and repeatedly violated orders. Military records show he was facing a court-martial, a serious charge that could lead to years in a U.S. military prison. For a 22-year-old private with no legal guidance and no understanding of long-term consequences, that future felt final. Inside the barracks, rumors circulated quietly. Stories about American soldiers who had crossed into North Korea and survived. Stories claiming they were treated well, used briefly for propaganda, and eventually returned through prisoner exchanges. There was no internet, no independent news, no way to verify what was true. Only fear, isolation, and second-hand information. In Dresnock's mind, the logic began to form. Prison in the United States felt certain. North Korea felt unknown, but possibly temporary. On the morning of August 15, 1962, that uncertainty felt preferable to the certainty waiting for him on the southern side of the border. Calling what James Joseph Dresnock formed in his head a plan would be generous, but to him, it felt like a calculation. There were no maps, no accomplices, and no rehearsals. What he had instead was a series of assumptions shaped by fear and incomplete information. He believed that crossing the border in daylight reduced the chance of being shot, because visibility made his intent clear. He believed that walking slowly, with no weapon and no attempt to hide, would signal surrender rather than aggression. He believed that North Korea needed him alive, not dead, because an American soldier who defected willingly was more valuable as a propaganda tool than as a corpse. Above all, he believed that the Cold War functioned through negotiation, that every hostile action existed within an unspoken framework of exchanges and reversals. In his mind, imprisonment in North Korea would be temporary, a holding pattern until diplomacy corrected his mistake. What he did not consider was the possibility that the system on the other side of the border did not recognize those rules at all. Dresnock also underestimated the DMZ itself. The border was not a simple line, but a layered obstacle, marked by fences, warning signs, and minefields designed to punish hesitation and chance. Yet luck, not preparation, carried him forward. He chose a point along the line he believed was less monitored and waited until midday, when guards on both sides were fully visible. He did not leave a note. He did not tell another soldier. Once he stepped away from his post, there was no mechanism to stop him. In the final moments before crossing, there was no dramatic pause or second thoughts recorded. According to later accounts, Dresnok simply began walking step by step toward the north. Every meter reduced the possibility of return. Every second committed him further to a decision built on assumptions he could no longer test. The plan had no final phase, no outcome beyond capture. There was no strategy for interrogation, no expectation of long-term confinement, and no concept of what life inside North Korea would actually demand. In that absence of foresight, the plan ended the moment he crossed the line, and whatever came next would be decided entirely by the people waiting on the other side. The moment James Joseph Dresnok crossed the demilitarized zone, control over his fate shifted instantly and completely. North Korean guards did not rush him, did not shout in English, and did not offer explanations. Weapons remained raised as he was surrounded, searched, and restrained. There was no formal arrest and no declaration of status. Within minutes, he was removed from the border area and transported away from the line he had just crossed, blindfolded and silent, with no understanding of where he was going or how far he was being taken. The crossing itself had taken only minutes. The consequences began immediately. Dresnok was moved through a series of secure locations, each more isolated than the last. Food was provided, but communication was restricted. He was questioned repeatedly, not aggressively at first, but methodically. The interrogators were less interested in secrets than in consistency. They asked the same questions over and over, looking for patterns, weaknesses, and contradictions. Dresnok had little to give. He was not an intelligence officer. He had no strategic knowledge. What he offered instead was his story, and that story became his value. Within days, it became clear that he was not being treated as a prisoner of war. There were no references to the Geneva Conventions, no indication of eventual release, and no mention of contact with the outside world. Instead, his captors focused on reshaping him. He was taught what to say, how to say it, and when to remain silent. As weeks turned into months, Dresnok realized that the assumptions behind his decision were collapsing. There was no timetable, no negotiation, no exit strategy being discussed behind closed doors. North Korea had not taken him in order to trade him back. They had taken him to keep him. His daily life settled into a controlled routine, language lessons, ideological instruction, and constant supervision. Every movement was observed. Every interaction was filtered. The border he crossed had not been a temporary mistake. It had been a permanent transition. Dresnok began to understand that his role was no longer defined by what he had done, but by what the state decided he would become. The execution of his plan was complete, but the operation had not ended. It had only entered a phase he had never imagined, one where time itself became the primary instrument of control. As the years passed, James Joseph Dresnok's existence inside North Korea settled into something that was neither imprisonment nor freedom, but a controlled simulation of normal life. He was given food, housing, and work, yet none of it belonged to him. Every element of his routine was assigned, monitored, and subject to change without explanation. The state did not punish him openly because it did not need to. Control was exercised through dependencies and isolation. Dresnok was kept away from ordinary citizens and placed alongside other foreign defectors, including a small number of American soldiers who would later follow the same path across the border. Together they lived under constant supervision, aware that any deviation from expected behavior could result in disappearance rather than discipline. Over time, Dresnok was trained to serve a specific function. He learned Korean fluently, memorized ideological scripts, and was cast in state-produced films designed to portray Americans as cruel, unstable, or morally corrupt. On screen, he played villains repeatedly, shouting orders, abusing civilians, and embodying the image the regime wanted its citizens to fear. Off-screen, he followed instructions carefully, understanding that cooperation was the only currency he possessed. The state gradually expanded his privileges, not as a reward, but as a reinforcement. He was permitted to marry, though the relationship was arranged. He was allowed to raise children, though their futures were predetermined by his status. He was given an apartment, though he could never choose where to live. To outside observers, this appeared to be survival, even adaptation. But survival came at a cost that accumulated silently. Dresnok could not leave the country, could not contact his family in the United States, and could not control the narrative of his own life. While the world outside moved forward, wars ended, governments fell, and the Cold War itself dissolved, Dresnok remained fixed in the role he had been assigned decades earlier. The invasion he believed would be temporary had become permanent. North Korea did not need to convince him of its ideology. It only needed him to remain useful, visible, and contained. By the time Dresnik fully understood this reality, the possibility of return no longer existed, not because it was forbidden, but because time itself had erased every path back. From the perspective of the United States military, James Joseph Dresnok's disappearance was registered quickly and then quietly closed. A private who walked across the DMZ alone carried no strategic value and possessed no classified knowledge worth negotiating over. Officially, he was listed as a deserter. There would be no rescue attempt, no diplomatic pressure campaign, and no sustained public effort to bring him home. As years passed, Dresnok became less a person and more a footnote, resurfacing only when North Korean propaganda materials were analyzed by intelligence agencies or when foreign journalists briefly encountered him under heavy supervision. Each appearance confirmed the same reality. He was alive, cooperative, and entirely beyond reach. Inside North Korea, Dresnok's role remained stable and unchanging. He continued appearing in films and broadcasts, reinforcing the state's narrative while living a life that looked outwardly settled but inwardly constrained. The assumptions that drove his original decision were never corrected by diplomacy or exchange. North Korea did not return defectors. It absorbed them. Over time, even the possibility of escape became theoretical. Dresnok had aged, built a family, and spent more years inside the country than he had ever lived in the United States. When he died in 2016 at the age of 76, it was not in a prison cell or under dramatic circumstances, but quietly inside the system he had entered voluntarily more than half a century earlier. His death did not trigger statements or negotiations. It simply confirmed what had long been true. The border he crossed in 1962 was not a temporary threshold, but a permanent boundary. Dresnok did not leave behind a legacy of victory or defiance. What remained was a single decision made under pressure, shaped by misinformation, fear, and urgency, and a lifetime spent paying for it in a way no court sentence ever could. James Joseph Dresnok didn't cross the border with a weapon, a unit, or a plan to conquer territory. He crossed it alone, driven by fear, pressure, and the belief that every system had an exit. In a literal sense, his action was simple: one man walking north across a line in the grass. But in effect, it was an invasion without an army, an entry without permission, and a decision that reshaped the rest of his life. For more than 40 years, Dresnok lived inside a country he never intended to stay in, performing a role he never chose, under rules he never understood until it was too late. He survived, but survival came without freedom, without return, and without the ability to undo the moment that defined everything after it. His story does not end with redemption or punishment, only with permanence. A single step, taken under the assumption that nothing was final, became the most final act of his life. So the question remains open. Did James Joseph Dresnok escape a system that was about to destroy him? Or did he walk willingly into a system that would consume him more completely? In a world defined by borders, ideology, and power, his story leaves behind an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most dangerous heist is not stealing money, secrets, or territory, but betting your entire future on the belief that someone else will eventually let you go.